Today's lesson is going to be about adding integers. First, let's review some vocabulary. So some previous vocab that we've gone over is integers, which are positive and negative whole numbers. So this lesson does apply to adding and subtracting just adding positive and negative fractions and decimals, but we are not going to cover that today. We're just going to focus on whole numbers, positives and negatives. The next one that we've talked about previously is opposites, and that opposites are numbers that are the same distance from zero but on different sides of zero when we're looking at a number line. And one thing that we want to make sure we remember about opposites is that opposites added together equals zero, which takes us to a new vocabulary term for us, which is neutral pairs. And the definition of neutral pairs is when positives and negatives cancel each other out, and this is very similar to opposites. So kind of the example I can give for this is that when we have the numbers 5 and -5, we would describe those as opposites. Now, if we were adding 5 and -5, this would create some neutral pairs, because neutral pairs is a positive and a negative and they cancel out, because if we have +1 and -1, add them together, okay, that equals 0. Well, it's going to always apply for opposites. So when we have that +5 and the -5, and we add them together, they're going to cancel out because they create neutral pairs, and that equals 0. The first problem we're going to look at is 5 plus -2. And I've just put our -2 into parentheses. This is pretty common practice. And that's just really trying to represent that this symbol right here goes with the 2. And again, that's read as -2. We always want to think of our negative signs as opposites, and that kind of negative signs and subtraction signs can sometimes mean similar or equivalent sort of things. So the first strategy I'm going to recommend when looking at this problem, and this strategy truly only really works with smaller numbers, but it's really good for getting that initial understanding of positive and negative numbers and adding them together. So what I'm going to do is directly underneath 5 here, I'm actually going to draw this out as 5 positive signs, okay, because that's +5. Now again, that first positive wasn't necessarily always there, but we don't need it. We know that's +5. So I have my 5 positive signs. And then we have our operation, kind of the plus sign here, and then we can really look at this as we're adding in 2 more negatives. So we have our 5 positives plus our 2 negatives. And this is where kind of our vocab term of neutral pairs really comes in, because we're going to start creating some neutral pairs. And a neutral pair is going to be a positive and a negative that cancel out. So what I like to do is I like to circle this first positive and this first negative, and we know that those are going to cancel out, because if I have a positive and I have a negative, I have 0. And then this next positive and negative cancel out, because one positive and one negative makes a neutral pair, and the neutral pair is going to equal 0. Now, we've now run out of negatives. And what is the only thing left, if you kind of want to think, sometimes I call it the game board, what's the only thing left here? Oh, 3 positives. So +5 plus -2 is going to be +3, because these 2 negatives created neutral pairs and canceled out 2 positives right here, and we were left with 3 positives, okay? So that's kind of how we use our neutral pairs. One shortcut as you're getting really good at this is you'll notice that out of the numbers 5 and 2, 2 is the smaller number, okay? Not looking at positives and negatives, but 2 is the smaller number, so those 2, or our smaller number, is always going to be how many neutral pairs we get. So we can take away those neutral pairs. 5 minus the 2 neutral pairs makes 3. Let's try it again on another problem. For our next example, we're going to do the problem -9 plus 5. You'll notice this time that we don't have parentheses around -9 because when the negative number is the first number in a problem, we usually just then make that assumption, or we know that that symbol is going to be a negative sign since we wouldn't start the problem with a subtraction sign. So I'm going to use the same strategy. I'm going to draw out my positives and negatives just to try to help me make sense of this problem. So I'm going to draw 9 negative signs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then I'm going to draw 5 positives. 1, and they make it kind of sloppy. 2, 3, 4, and 5. All right, so in this case, right away we see that we have more negatives than positives. So let's create some neutral pairs, and let's kind of circle and kind of eliminate those neutral pairs, or those numbers that are going to cancel out. And again, when you have a negative and you have a positive, it's like taking one step backwards and one step forward, and you're actually just going to end up in the exact same place that you started in. All right, so as I go through here, I know that this first negative and positive are going to cancel out, and they're going to cancel out, and they're going to cancel out, and cancel out, and cancel out. And what are we left with? We are left with 4 negatives. Okay. All right, and then another way of kind of looking at this is we could have recognized right away that we have more negatives than positives, and we can see that visually. So we know that the 5 positives are going to take away or kind of cancel out 5 negatives, and so we can just do 9 minus those 5, and then we end up with -4. Another kind of strategy for thinking this problem through is thinking about like teams, okay? So if we had a negative team and a positive team, and then we'd say, okay, the negative team has 9, the positive team has 5, so which team has more? Oh, the negative team has more, so that tells us our answer is negative. And how many more does the negative team have? Well, if the negative team has 9 and the positive team has 5, the negative team has 4 more negatives than the positive team has positives. So we have an answer of -4. Sometimes when we're adding integers, we actually end up adding 2 integers of the same sign. So one way you've noticed this is you've always added positive numbers. That's something you learned way back in elementary school. And you knew how to add, and you added them, and you got your answers were good. But what if we're adding 2 negative integers or 2 negative numbers together? How is that going to work? Do we still get neutral pairs? Are there still things canceling out, or is it going to be handled differently? So just to start, we'll kind of use that same strategy. We'll draw this out just to kind of give us that visual element for this. So this one would look like if I have 6 negatives, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 negatives, and then I'm adding 5 negatives. So instead of drawing 5 plus signs, these are still negatives, so I'm going to draw in 5 more negatives. Now, in having it drawn like this, do we have any neutral pairs? Do we have anything that's going to start to cancel out? And hopefully you're saying no, because we don't. In order to have a neutral pair, you have to have positives and negatives. And in this case, we only have negatives, so then our question is going to become, well, how many negatives do we have? Well, if we had -6 or 6 negatives, and then we added 5 more negatives, that means we have 11 negatives, or -11, the proper way to say that number. So when we're adding negatives together, it's actually very, very similar to when we were adding positive numbers. And we actually can kind of summarize these into 2 situations or 2 rules. Let's take a look. When you are adding integers, just keep in mind these 2 rules or kind of situations, because these are the situations you're going to encounter. If you are adding integers that have the same sign, meaning both numbers are positive or both numbers are negatives, you're going to keep the sign the same, and then you're going to just add those numbers together like normal. So for example, let's say you have the problem, and we'll keep a positive start. We'll say you have 3 plus 7, okay? And these are both positive numbers. You've done this for a long time. They're both positive, so the answer is going to be positive, and 3 plus 7 is 10. Now, let's say you have a problem, and I'll keep the number similar. Let's say you have -3 plus -7. Okay, now in this problem, both numbers are negative, so our answer's definitely going to be negative. And then we're just going to add 3 and 7 together. 3 plus 7 is 10, but we know our answer is going to be -10 because we are adding -3 and -7. The signs are the same. The sign is the same for the answer. We add the numbers together. Now, the other scenario, though, is when the signs are different, okay? So when you are adding a positive number and a negative number, or if we flip it around, a negative number and a positive number, you're going to keep the sign that has more. And I say more because that's going to really, when you look at the numbers, okay, are there more negatives or are there more positives? Okay, and then once you keep that, you keep the sign of whatever is more, you're going to cancel kind of those neutral pairs, or subtract is how some of us like to think of it, the lesser sign. So let's say we have, maybe this is 3 plus -7. Okay, so one's positive and one's negative. So this is where we're going to look at our two add-ins, the two numbers we're adding, and which has more. Do the negatives have more or do the positives have more? In this case, we have -7, which is definitely more negatives than the 3 positives. So our answer is going to be a negative number. So I put my negative symbol in there, and I'm going to write this with parentheses. You don't necessarily have to, just how I'm going to do it this time. So we know our answer is going to be negative. So now the second part is where we're going to kind of cancel out those neutral pairs. So we have more negatives. We have 7 negatives to be specific, and we have 3 positives. So those 3 positives are going to cancel out with 3 negatives, leaving 4 negatives behind. And if you had to draw it out, that's totally okay. Eventually, I hope that we'll get to the point where we can solve these without drawing them out. In this case, we know that the 3 positives are going to cancel with 3 of the negatives, leaving a final answer of 4 negatives left behind. Now, if we look at this the other way, let's say this problem was -3 plus +7. All right, and the same thing in this problem. We have more positives than negatives this time. So our answer is going to be positive, and I might just choose to write my answer with a plus sign or a positive sign here. You don't have to, but you can. And in this case, we'd also say, okay, well, how many more positives do we have than negatives? And in this problem, we have 4 more positives than negatives because our 3 negatives would cancel out with 3 of the positives, leaving behind 4 positives. Now, I would strongly encourage you to either pause this video and write these rules down, maybe into your notebook or somewhere where you can find it, or go ahead and screenshot these rules so if you need to refer back to them, you can. So pause the video now. I'm going to continue on in about 3 seconds. For the last thing in this lesson, I would like you to pause this video and try solving these 4 problems. So use kind of the rules and strategies we've talked about. Maybe write out some negative and positive signs, create those neutral pairs. We're going to go over them in a little bit, so please pause now if you haven't already. So for the first problem, I got a final answer of +2. I did use the drawing out method, and we ended up with 4 neutral pairs, so 4 negatives with 4 positives, leaving behind just 2 positives. Going to the right, the next problem was -8 plus -1. Since both of these are negatives, I didn't draw this one out because I knew I was just going to combine my negatives, okay? Because when we have that same sign, we keep the same sign, we add them together. So since -8 and -1 are both negative, my answer is negative, and 8 plus 1 is 9. Going to the bottom left, it was the same thing. We had -12 plus -5. Since both of them are negative, I knew my answer would be negative, and I just did 12 plus 5, which makes 17. So -12 plus -5 is -17. And our last question in the bottom right was 9 plus -4. I did draw this one out since I had positives and negatives. We ended up with 4 neutral pairs again for this problem. Those neutral pairs cancel out, and I was left over with +5. Alright, so hopefully you've learned something in this video. I am going to go back to our rules screen. So just in case you need to write these down, pause, or screenshot them still, I would strongly encourage you to do so. Thanks, guys.